This presentation lays the groundwork for a series of studies dealing with selected publications of Professor Charles B. Namm. Characteristically, the opening line in one chapter of Professor Namm's self-penned short life history begins with a sentence about vital statistics.
The birth certificate shows I was born Charles Benjamin Namowitz, March 25, 1926, in Lynbrook, New York. The family name was changed when I was a small child, so when I entered school, I was already called Charles Namm.
Charlie grew up in a succession of communities in the New York metropolitan area. He worked in his family's small businesses, including dry goods stores and a candy store newsstand, and progressed through grade school and high school in a highly normal manner. Though part of a Jewish family and community, Charlie did not live in a particularly religious environment. Still, to bring great happiness to a very religious uncle and aunt, he prepared for and celebrated his bar mitzvah in this community. Charlie had not really contemplated a college education, assuming that he would be going to work after high school. But his high school years coincided with World War II, and when he graduated at age 17 in 1943, no employers were very interested in a young man who obviously was draft bait. After heartfelt talks with his family, he decided he would go straight into the Army and get it over with. The Army recruiting officer suggested that he take a test to get into the Army Specialized Reserve Training Program. He did so well on this test that he was assigned to Harvard University, where he spent a year alternating between studying history, math, boxing, and physics with other Harvard students as an ordinary freshman, and wearing his Army uniform to remind him of what lay just ahead. This program lasted only a year because the following spring brought the Battle of the Bulge and a new sense of urgency in Army recruiting. The training program was cut short, and Charlie rode trains first to Fort Bragg, then to Camp Polk in Louisiana, and finally to Fort Dix in New Jersey to learn about artillery in the 170th Field Battalion. After training, the battalion shipped out to England on the Queen Mary, which was serving as a troop ship. At this point in the war, the Allies had pushed the Germans back to the Rhine River. Charlie's unit caught up with the front lines of the war in time to invade Germany itself and participate in the final months leading up to the German surrender. The Namm family was blessed to have both Charlie and his sister Vera, who had served as a cook with the Women's Army Corps in the Pacific, return home in 1945 with only Vera's touch of malaria as a consequence of the experience. Actually, Charlie's unit came back to the United States after VE Day while the war was still raging in the Pacific. He reported to Camp Hood in Texas and would have shipped out for the Pacific if the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan had not cut the war short in 1945. At Camp Hood, he already started thinking about what to do after the war. Harvard had invited him to return, but even with the GI Bill, his family couldn't afford that. The Fort Hood Base Library provided the inspiration he needed, as he explained in his own words in his life story.
On a shelf in the library were maybe 100 or more pamphlets produced by the U.S. Department of Labor, each of which related to a different occupational path. Over a few nights, I read through every one of the pamphlets. At one point, I got to one labeled statistician. I enjoyed playing around with statistics about baseball players, but I didn't know there was actually a profession called statistician. I not only read that pamphlet twice, but I checked several of the references in it. I figured I have found my direction, so I applied to several colleges that had majors in statistics. One of them was New York University in downtown Manhattan.
And so Charles Namm returned to college in New York. He lived at home to save money, studied at night as a night student, and quickly progressed to full-time day study and helped to found the NYU Statistical Society, a sign of things to come. He graduated in 1950 and took an exam for employment as a statistician with the federal government. Predictably, the most likely place for a statistician around 1950 was the Census Bureau. Charlie became one of a couple dozen junior professional assistants who went to work on the results of the 1950 census. After President Eisenhower got into office, massive reductions in force of federal employees eventually caught up with these young demographers. Census supervisors tried for a time to hide him out in an international section doing secret work on Russian demographic data for the Defense Department. But in the end, the RIF caught up with him. He lost his government job in 1952. However, one of his bosses in the secret program put him onto a civilian job. Within months, Charlie became a statistician at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. In this unlikely setting, far from the scenes of his university days in New York and his statistical work in Washington, Charles Nam's career suddenly took its first dramatic turning. During a one-month advisory visit to the base, Professor Rupert Vance from Chapel Hill encountered the young Nam, spotted his potential, and recruited him for graduate study in North Carolina. Nam jumped at the chance. It is worth taking a moment to bring out some of Charlie's impressions of Rupert Vance, one of the great figures in American demography.
According to the authorities on polio, Rupert Vance was the longest living child polio case in the United States. His legs were completely deformed, but the upper half of his body was powerful because he would never go in a wheelchair. He would go on crutches. People admired him greatly for that. Vance had written about the population of the South. It was the first descriptive and analytical studies of the Southern population. I was fascinated because it was more than the humdrum census statistics. He put life into them.
In North Carolina, Charlie found himself swimming in a whole new ocean. For one thing, it was not much like New York City. Although his work still had statistics in it, suddenly he had to come to grips with the entire vast horizons of sociology and demography as substantive contexts within which to apply his specialized skills. This only whetted his imagination, however, and he thrived in the department at Chapel Hill. For one thing, this Jewish boy from New York met a charming, intelligent Southern Baptist girl from the Piedmont of North Carolina. By 1955, they were committed to each other, and on New Year's Day of 1956, he married Marjorie in her parents' home in Hickory, North Carolina. Everyone who has known this splendid couple will testify to the wonderful relationship they enjoyed, and will also recognize that their marriage energized Charlie and provided the solid foundation that allowed him to go on to all the achievements of his later career. He earned his MA degree in 1957 after Marjorie had already earned her own. They both moved back to Washington, D.C. that year, where Charlie went back to work for the Census Bureau. Marjorie taught at Prince George's County Community College. They lived in Washington for the next 7 years, and Charlie has written this became forever our favorite place to live. While working at the Census Bureau, Charlie also continued working on his dissertation. For people accustomed to downloading datasets from the internet and running elaborate statistical analysis from packaged computer programs, the nature of this work provides an instructive contrast.
I was interested in immigration and the adaptation of immigrants to U.S. life, particularly socioeconomic status. I must have hand calculated about 150 statistical tables from 1950 census results, and each one had nationality groups looking at their educational and occupational distributions. I needed a calculator, and I couldn't afford a calculator. So I went down to the Marchant Calculating Company. Could they let me rent a calculator at some reduced rate? Apparently, they were impressed with my sincerity and let me have one at no charge for up to 3 months. I took the calculator to my apartment, and for 3 months, nights when I got home from work and over weekends, I did nothing but punch out multiple standardizations. Then I returned the calculator and set about doing the analysis. It took me a long time to write it up, and I had to mail chapters back and forth to Vance.
Vance certainly had some strong reactions to the initial chapter drafts, as Charlie recounts in his life history.
I spent about a year working on Census Bureau reports, and you know how dull and boilerplate they can be. Apparently, it dulled my writing style, whatever writing style I had before. When I sent the first two analytical chapters of my dissertation to Vance, he sent them back with a note saying, "What's happened to you? Your writing has gotten terrible." Ever since, I've been very conscious about my writing.
Obviously, Charles Namm quickly figured out how to write better text. During this stint at the Census Bureau, he not only completed his dissertation and obtained his PhD, but began to publish the steady stream of professional work that has characterized his career ever since. Work from his dissertation appeared in Social Forces in 1959 as Nationality Groups and Social Stratification in America, even before he began to author census reports in the P27 series on educational status and school attendance in the country. His early publications in the Journal of the American Statistical Association and other leading journals usually concerned education statistics he supervised as chief of the Education and Social Stratification branch at the Census Bureau. It looked like he had indeed found his career niche. But of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that this impression of a solidly entrenched career was completely wrong. Charlie Namm's life was about to take its second major turn.
In 1963, I realized that my census work was winding down, and even though I was assured that my job was permanent, I did not feel my work activity was challenging enough. I decided it was time for an academic position. Marjorie agreed with me, although it would almost certainly mean leaving the D.C. area.
This realization, this decision to make another major career change, even though they had adopted two children and started a family in Washington, D.C., doubtless calls to mind decisions by other friends and colleagues who've worked at the Census Bureau. The lure of academic life has proved too strong for many other census employees besides Charles Namm, and these have often proved to be some of the best scholars in our discipline. Thus it was that Florida State University inherited an accomplished statistician experienced in the intricacies of Washington politics and government statistics, who also had recently gotten a biology PhD from Chapel Hill. He came to Tallahassee to breathe life into the field of population research. In short order, he did just that. Charlie brought with him a grant from the U.S. Office of Education to do research on education and social structure, with which he hired some graduate students and started to work. Almost immediately, he supplemented that first grant with a second one for nearly $250,000 from the Public Health Service to do further research on social structure. A year later, he added a third grant from the Office of Education to study educational opportunities, and suddenly FSU had a research machine with more than $500,000 of grant funding, graduate students writing dissertations, presenting research papers at conferences, and publishing professional articles. And the population program was off and running. Charles Namm never even paused to look back. Other universities, notably Ohio State and his alma mater of Chapel Hill, made serious efforts to lure him away to help them with their own population programs. But luckily for Tallahassee, these attempts to raid the FSU program did not work out. Instead, the program kept gathering steam. In 1967, Charlie developed the first institutional structure to support these research efforts, the Population and Manpower Research Center. Professor Namm's first textbook, a reader called Population and Society, appeared in 1968. It is dedicated to Rupert Vance. I have had my copy of the famous green volume on my shelf since my graduate student days. This book was the first in a long and distinguished lineage of valuable volumes that have given many young demographers and sociologists their first glimpse of new intellectual horizons. If there's a hallmark to Namm's career, more than many of our other colleagues, he has always found a way to create a balance between research and teaching and to capitalize on the synergies that are possible between these two pillars of academic life. After his first dramatic surge of success in the academic realm, it was predictable that the sociology department would wreak its revenge on Charlie. This came in the form of making him chairman of the department from 1968 through 1971, which did slow down his grants and publications for a brief period. However, he was an ideal departmental citizen and conducted his administrative term conscientiously and with goodwill. He also used his chairman's position to good effect in recruiting potential colleagues and agreed to become the editor of Demography, the official journal of the Population Association of America, from 1972 through 1974. During these years, Charlie also helped to found the Center for the Study of Population, providing a solid infrastructure supporting the new research efforts. Charles Namm became the first director of the center he helped to create and continued to guide its operation until 1981. In recognition of his research, publication, teaching, and contributions to the discipline in general, he was elected to the presidency of the Population Association of America in 1979. Work from this period of his career eventually culminated in a book co-authored with Mary Powers, The Socioeconomic Approach to Status Measurement, published in 1983. This alternative approach to measuring socioeconomic status continues to form one of the major strands of Namm's lifelong work in the social sciences. The research center that Charles Namm helped to create at Florida State University continues today as an ongoing and expanding resource for scholars of demography and population health. The following series of videos reviews selected published works by Professor Namm and appears here by way of honoring that great legacy.